coming on the air tonight with the first group of people trapped in Gaza now evacuating from the war zone. What we're learning about how this deal came to be and what comes next for the hundreds of others waiting their turn as another Israeli airstrike devastates a refugee camp in Gaza. Plus, how a spike in anti-Semitism is changing how some Jewish communities want to defend themselves. In South Florida, that may mean more guns. We'll explain. Then Donald Trump Jr. on the stand, testifying in the fraud case against his father. We are live outside court where he just left with the vibe check. Then some new questions about how safe eye drops actually are after those FDA warnings about infections, what to know now, and when not to freak out with our medical expert. Plus, remember all that backlash Adidas got for how long it took to cut ties with Kanye West after his anti-Semitic comments? Turns out, according to the New York Times, Adidas spent nearly a decade tolerating similar stuff behind the scenes. We are going behind the scenes one-on-one with the reporter on that scoop coming up a little later in the show. Don't miss that. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and tonight, a new glimmer of hope in Gaza, with the first civilians now evacuating, the very first to make it out since the Israel-Hamas war started. You see it here. This is some video coming into us showing people crowded at that Rafah border crossing with Egypt. You had dozens of people hurt and leaving, crossing into Egypt in ambulances. Others pushed through an open gate. Roughly 500 foreigners, including a handful of Americans, are also set to evacuate, according to a source briefed on negotiations. Listen to what some of the people getting out are telling our team after this new deal came through, brokered by the Qataris and the Americans. Listen.
We are relying on God and hoping we get out. It is still our country and we feel sad for it, for its destruction, for our friends and loved ones. Entire families were destroyed and erased, all martyred. If it wasn't for what happened, we wouldn't leave it.
This comes as we are just learning that dozens of people may be trapped under debris right now after a second Israeli strike appears to have hit a refugee camp near Gaza City today. Just 24 hours after a blast hit that same camp, killing dozens of people and fueling new anger about the cost this war is having on civilians, with conditions getting more and more desperate. Look at this. Multiple rockets now fired from northern Gaza and toward Israel, as the Israeli military is now putting more tanks near the Gaza border. The military says they're hitting more Hamas command centers and that they killed two top leaders of Hamas in the last 24 hours, all of it in retaliation for that terror strike against Israel back on October 7th. I want to bring in Ellison Barber on the ground there on the Israel-Gaza border. And Ellison, we're going to get to this sort of intensifying military moment in just a second, but I want to play what we're just hearing from President Biden in just the last couple of minutes on these new evacuations. Here's the president.
Today, thanks to concerted American leadership, we're in a situation where safe passage for wounded Palestinians and foreign nationals to exit Gaza has started. The American citizens are able to exit today as part of the first group of probably over 1,000.
Ellison, you hear the president there saying that there is more to come here. What else do we know about how this deal went down and what does actually come next to get some of these civilians out of Gaza, which is, of course, under fire?
Yeah, we're already hearing from the media spokesperson on the Palestinian side of the border saying they do plan to open the Rafah border crossing again tomorrow to allow foreign nationals and those with dual citizenship to cross again. What NBC News has learned about how this deal came to be, essentially, according to sources speaking with NBC News, it was mediated primarily by Qatar, and it was a deal that was constructed between Israel, Hamas, Egypt, as well as the United States. And again, Qatar acting as the primary mediator between those four groups. Part of this deal, as we understand it right now, is that up to 500 foreign nationals and those with dual citizenship could be allowed to cross the border into Egypt every single day. What we don't know right now is exactly how long they are planning to allow that to take place, but they've said possibly up to 500 per day. And there is a list of pre-approved people that authorities have on the Egyptian side of the border, and ultimately it's Egyptian officials who will decide exactly when those pre-approved people are able to leave and how. We have heard in the past, Hallie, that we expect those people, foreign nationals, to then be taken to Cairo, where they can then make it home to wherever their final destination is. But this is the first time this border has been opened like this since October 7th, and there have been a lot of false starts where people thought it was going to happen, and then it didn't. So today it was an incredibly big moment for people who've been trying to leave. Hallie?
Yeah, very significant. people have been bringing luggage, suitcases, kids, for example, to that border day in and day out to some degree, thinking this would be the moment. Now you have this significant piece that's happening. It's all happening, of course, on the context of what some of the international community are calling for, which is a ceasefire, right? Especially after those that Israeli strike on a refugee camp in Gaza. At the same time, you are seeing it on the ground, right? The Israeli military has said there will be a next phase of this war, that this country has the right to defend itself after that Hamas terror attack.
Yeah, I mean, every day, Hallie, since Friday night when Israel acknowledged that they had ground forces inside of northern Gaza and that they were going to be staying there, at least for the foreseeable future, every single day since then, we have heard from Israeli military leaders, Israeli political leaders, talking about how they are continuing to expand their efforts inside of Gaza. They have made it very clear that ultimately they do not plan to stop this fight until they have fully dismantled Hamas. And what we are seeing, what is making so many people in the international community concerned, is a major, major toll on civilians. And we saw that twice with the Jabaliya refugee camp. That's in northern Gaza. Yes, that's an area where Israel has told people to evacuate from. But we have also seen in recent days strikes in southern Gaza, the very place Israel has been telling people to go to. Hallie.
Ellison Barber, live for us there in Israel, right along the border. Thank you so much. I want to bring in our national security analyst, Clint Watts, now, who is posted up at the big board for us. And Clint, you heard Ellison talking about it, right? The strike on this refugee camp here. How does it fit into military operations as they stand now and as they are predicted and expected to stand in the days to come?
That's right, Hallie. If we just take a look at what's happened over the last week, several things. One, 6 days ago, 2 breach points here and here. The Israeli military setting up what is an assembly area, which they are now using to advance in multiple columns down this area closer to the beach, while also coming down here to Johor, where there's been a lot of combat operations, and up this main street where they've created a blocking position trying to prevent Hamas militants moving north to south. They've also moved in here over to the northeast, set up another assembly area. And what you can see them doing is setting up battle positions to seal off the town. But that doesn't speak to actually what's going on in terms of airstrikes. What we've been talking about is airstrikes that have happened in different areas around Jabaliya, but also around all of North Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces say they're striking targets with underground bunkers, caves, hitting Hamas leaders. The Palestinians who are trapped here in Gaza, they're saying something very different, that these refugee camps and innocent women and children are being struck.
You're an expert in this, Clint, so talk about urban warfare, right? I mean, we know that Gaza, the area that you've shown here, the Strip, is so densely packed. I mean, it is very, very condensed here. And we know that the Israelis have said that Hamas uses civilians as, in their words, human shields, essentially. There's a real impact on the lives of innocent people who are not, fighting on behalf of Hamas here.
Hallie, it's the worst case scenario. Urban warfare, particularly in this zone here, you're talking about just a matter of 5 miles wide at times, or only 2 miles in. This area is extremely dense. If you look at where these airstrikes hit, and you can tell based on the cone, essentially, of these pictures and the way it is struck into here, they're going after something that is potentially underground and deep. And the Israeli Defense Forces would say, we're going after Hamas leaders who are operating from underground bunkers, which could be true. We don't know, and we haven't verified. But at the same point, in this kind of a density, you're going to have women, children, civilians killed. Urban warfare, it's the worst kind of warfare to try and navigate and be surgical and restore the peace.
Clint Watts, thank you so much for that breakdown. It's illuminating, for sure. Appreciate it. Let's bring it back here to the United States, because an extraordinary moment is just wrapping up in New York court today with Donald Trump Jr. taking the stand in that massive civil tax fraud case against his father. The case, of course, in which prosecutors are accusing former President Trump of lying about how much money he was actually worth. Watch this.
Don, will you come talk to us?
Just a wave there from Donald Trump Jr. as he's walking out of court just in the last couple of minutes here. He didn't stop and talk to reporters to answer their questions. He did answer questions on the stand. This is him right beforehand. You see him kind of smiling here. He joked at one point that maybe he should have worn some makeup. Fairly chill vibes. And the questioning so far, remember, has come from essentially his father's own team. At one point, the judge and Don Jr. were joking back and forth. Keep in mind, this is just the beginning of what we expect to be a parade of Trump children, adult children, coming to testify here. Don Jr., then Eric Trump, the former president himself, and next week Ivanka Trump as well. And listen, Dad, he's not happy about it. Mr. Trump posting, "Leave my children alone," and to the judge, "You are a disgrace to the legal profession." Let's bring in Lindsay Reiser, who's outside court for us now. According to our team in court, it seemed like Trump Jr. was pretty relaxed, but he hasn't been cross-examined yet by prosecutors. That is where we expect things to potentially get kind of spicy, right?
Well, right now, he is in direct examination by prosecutors. He is right now, Hallie, the state's witness. And so we know that we are expecting cross-examination soon. That will be by the defense team. Now, let me sort of summarize a little bit of the testimony so far. He has been testifying to the nature of his titles and involvement in the Trump organization. And that includes in some of these properties that they acquired through loans that they would then develop into hotels. And remember, it is those statements of financial condition that were used to get those loans that the Attorney General's office alleges included favorable terms that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten had they not overvalued their assets. I want to go into a little bit more about some of the direct examination here, a little bit more of the back and forth. So I'm going to read a little bit from our notes from the producer inside the courtroom. Donald Trump Jr. was asked whether he was familiar with GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles. He said he learned about it in Accounting 101. Hallie, in his deposition, he had joked that the only thing he knew about it was that they were generally accepted. And he seemed to point the finger at Donald Bender with Mazars. That was the main accounting firm that they used for many, many years. And also with Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO of the Trump organization, Hallie.
It's a big deal, right, to have the former president's adult children here testifying here. I mean, there's a lot at stake.
Absolutely. An extraordinary moment here, really setting up for potentially days of blockbuster testimony. And this is really what is at stake. The entire business empire, they made their names here in New York, and whether or not they can run businesses here in New York is at stake. We can expect to hear after from Eric Trump and then from the former president himself on Monday, followed by Ivanka Trump, who is no longer a co-defendant, on Wednesday. But certainly there is a lot at stake, Hallie, including potentially up to $250 million. That's the damages that the Attorney General's office is asking for in this case, Hallie.
Lindsay Reiser, thank you so much. Appreciate it. More to come here as we talk about what else is happening, of course, in and around New York, including a Cornell student being held without bail tonight for allegedly making online threats to Jewish students at his school. Patrick Day, charged with posting threats online to kill or hurt fellow students. We got to warn you here that some of these threats are absolutely disturbing. They are horrifying. The complaint alleges that Day posted to an online discussion board threatening to, I'm quoting here, shoot up a campus building, and that he'd stab or slit the throat of Jewish men on campus and rape Jewish women before throwing them off a cliff. In an interview with the FBI, Day admits to making the posts, with Cornell saying in a statement they remain shocked and condemn these horrific anti-Semitic threats. I want to bring in Tom Winter now. And Tom, clearly just nightmarish, disgusting posts here that were made by Day. Talk about what happened in court and what these charges say about what he faces and where this goes.
Right, Hallie. So first off, from court today, this was an arrest on a criminal complaint, meaning they'll either have to have a preliminary hearing later. That almost never happens, or he'll actually be indicted at a later time. Of course, that's assuming he won't have a plea deal. We'll get to that in a moment. As far as the charges here and as far as what occurred in court, there was no plea taken today. He did not waive his rights to a future bail hearing, but for now, he's not going to get bail. They didn't even bother to have any sort of a detention hearing. So that's where things stand from court today. And he does face that single count of making a threat. It's effectively just making a threat over the internet, or he could have done it over his cell phone. As far as any sort of domestic terrorism charges, we really don't have those type of statutes here in this country. But this is a type of threat that they can deal with, Hallie, most effectively through this 18 U.S.C. 875. That's the specific law. So you don't have a designated group, in other words, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You just have to say, look, you can speak what you want to in this country, but the second you threaten somebody with violence, that breaks the law if you're using the internet, if you're using the phone or the mail, for instance. So as soon as he did that, they could charge him. That's the tool that they used. Of course, further charges could come up at some point when he is indicted and as this investigation proceeds. One thing we didn't get answered in court today, Hallie, what did they find when they executed a search warrant yesterday? Were there weapons? Could that be part of it? We'll just have to see.
Can you talk about the reaction here from Cornell, the way that this is reverberating, the potential that there might end up being some kind of a deal here, if that's even a possibility on the table?
Right. So you're referencing the deal, and I hinted at it before, because in yesterday's complaint, after Day apparently received his Miranda warning from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, he admitted to the Post, not that the evidence wasn't pretty strong, because he didn't use anything to mask his IP address when he made one of those threatening posts that you laid out before, or 6 additional emails, which seem to even go beyond some of the things that you read, if you can believe that, Hallie. So that's how they were able to get to that point. As far as where things go from here, he's likely not going to be going back to the school, and the university has put out several strong statements denouncing the things that he posted. Hallie.
Tom Winter, thank you very much. In New York, the fate of the former king of crypto is about to be in the hands of the 12 jurors who have spent the past month sitting just feet away from Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF, as you may have heard him called, in his historic fraud trial. Deliberations will probably start tomorrow, since right now the defense is still delivering closing arguments. SBF's attorneys say the government is turning him into a monster, and that bad business decisions that led to the downfall of his company, FTX, are not a crime. The prosecution earlier reminding the jury, SBF said, "I can't recall," more than 140 times during his testimony. And they brought up the thousands of people who lost billions collectively when FTX collapsed, all while Bankman-Fried was tweeting that all was fine. SBF now faces a potential life sentence if convicted on these fraud charges tied to both FTX and his hedge fund, Alameda Research, which crumbled last year. He has pleaded not guilty. Glad to have Kate Rooney joining us now, who's been covering every minute of this trial for us. It's been interesting to see the judge in this case, Kate, seeming, and I don't want to overread into it, but seeming kind of frustrated at times. At one point saying he has an interesting way of answering questions during his testimony, which seemed to be an allusion to him being kind of evasive here. How does that play into this case that is now about to go to a jury as they decide whether he's going to end up effectively spending the rest of his life behind bars or not?
Yeah, that is the word of the week, is evasive. He dodged questions. The judge went after him for that, and at some points just looked at him and said, answer the question, listen to the question, and seemed to be scolding him at certain points. That doesn't likely play well with the jury. They've really tried to question his credibility today, at least the prosecution, in their closing statements, saying this was supposed to be one of the smartest guys out there. He went to MIT, he studied physics and math, and he raised billions of dollars. He built these billion-dollar companies, and now all of a sudden you're supposed to believe that he was clueless. They said there's no way. They told the jury that he was lying up there. They said that he lied to you on the stand, laid out a few different reasons, and then said that he knew about what was going on at his hedge fund and his crypto company, some of the issues, the multi-billion-dollar holes, and he went on and doubled down and gambled with customer money anyway. They called it plain roulette. So that has really been what they're focused on, really challenging his credibility and making the jury believe that he was lying on the stand.
What has the defense said to all this? Like, what is the response when these questions come up about SBF potentially being evasive?
So they've been trying to answer that directly. They said there are certain instances where he was being evasive, but it's because he genuinely didn't know. So they pointed to more than 50 media interviews he did with Andrew Ross Sorkin, myself even. They pulled up multiple interviews where he said, oh, I don't quite remember saying that. They tried to smooth it over and say, well, that's because he did so many of them. And they tried to sort of explain away some of those evasive answers. They're up there right now still. The court session is going to go a couple hours longer than usual. They're going to go until 6 or 6:30. And they're up there saying that the prosecution is painting him as a villain, really. They said it's not a movie. There's a lot more subtle details that you need to think about, and they've really tried to say he's not a villain, and that's what the government is trying to paint him as.
Kate Rooney, live for us there in New York. Lots to watch, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about, Kate, in the days to come. Appreciate it. So listen, these concerns we've been talking about over the course of the last few weeks about anti-Semitic rhetoric and attacks seem to have more Jewish Americans thinking about how to defend themselves if it came to that, to the point that some gun instructors and Jewish security groups all across the country say they've been flooded with new clients ever since that Hamas attack October 7th.
Flat? Okay, not bad. Again.
You see it here in South Florida, where this gun shop owner used to offer his training once or twice a week. Now he's doing sessions once or twice per day. And out west in L.A., a rabbi who runs self-defense and firearm training classes for the Jewish community says he's gotten 600 calls in just about a week telling us we can't put the phone down without picking up the next one. I want to bring in NBC's Sam Brock, who's reporting this one out for us. Talk to me, Sam, because you have been talking to people as to why they made the decision to go and, in some cases, arm themselves here.
Sure, Hallie. There have been incidents of anti-Semitism all across the country. They have crescendoed, of course, in recent weeks with that ADL reporting. It's up somewhere in the neighborhood of 400% in the 3 weeks after the Hamas attack. But the reality is that this is something that many people were concerned about on the ground level for years. Jewish families feeling targeted. Now, a lot of the women that we spoke with, you're looking at the video right now, did not plan on owning a firearm. When I went to a weeknight session, I actually asked them, how many of you have had at any point in your life a firearm in your household? And a handful of people put their hands up. And then I said, okay, how many of you never thought in your wildest imagination that you would ever own or use a gun? And almost every single hand in that room went up, which is to say that this was not the mindset that people walked into the situation with. They just feel like the ground has shifted. Things have changed. When you start fearing for your kids' lives and seeing notes being slipped under doors that say you will die because you're Jewish, or graffiti that pops up in their neighborhood, as one woman told me, which said, "Free Gaza, kill all Jews," they are feeling threatened. Here is a bit of insight into one woman, Michelle. She's a parent of several younger children. She talked about her mindset before and after. Take a listen. Did you think that a day would come where you would feel compelled to go get a firearm?
When I was younger, no. But becoming a parent and becoming more aware of the climate, especially in the last 3 weeks, how can you not have a gun? I mean, it's very scary.
How can you not have a gun? And Hallie, I will say that there is confliction still. One woman who had gone to the range, we saw a video of her, Sahar, a little while ago, fired a weapon and decided, you know what, I can't do it. It's not for me. But many of these people right now, parents and families and grandparents, feel compelled that they need to do it.
And Sam, I mean, you're there in South Florida. You're talking to these folks in South Florida. This is not just a South Florida thing, right?
This is what struck me the most, is when we spoke with a rabbi who does a program, Hallie, that is more holistic. It is both firearm training and security and education out in Los Angeles. And you mentioned he had 600 calls in about a week. He said, we're underwater. We don't have enough staffing right now to educate and help all of the people that are reaching out. And he likened this, and this really struck me, to 9/11 in the sense that flying before and after 9/11 was never the same. And he said before and after 10/7, communal security for the Jewish community will never, ever be the same again. Hallie?
Sam Brock, thank you so much for bringing us that reporting. It is fascinating. We're going to look for more of that tonight on NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, wherever you watch your local NBC station. Sam, thanks. We got a lot more coming up here on this show, including a very rare vote set to go down any minute that could kick controversial Congressman George Santos out of office. We'll tell you what's going down on the Hill tonight. Plus, some new guidelines for lung cancer screening suggesting millions more people should get checked every year. More in the 5 things in a sec. How country superstar Jason Aldean is defending that controversial music video that critics called pro-lynching. That's coming up in the 5 things. But first, a controversial congressman could end up one step closer to being kicked out of office tonight. Here's a live look now at the House of Representatives debating a resolution that says George Santos is not fit to serve. That's the resolution. This is ahead of a vote that could come in the next few hours. Remember, Congressman Santos has admitted to lying or misleading people, voters, about a lot of stuff. He said he graduated from a couple of colleges, then said he actually didn't graduate from any college at all. He said he had extensive Wall Street experience, said he worked for Citigroup or Goldman Sachs. Neither company has any record of him working there. Removing a congressman, kicking a congressman out of, do you know what? That almost never happens. In all of our country's history, it has only happened 5 times. 5 times before, that's it. Santos's removal, if it happens, would narrow the GOP's already razor-thin majority. Hallie Vitale is joining us now. But Hallie, we need yet another potentially history-making thing to happen this month in Congress, right? I mean, it has been unprecedented is the word of the year here, and this isn't unprecedented, but it's certainly not common here. What is your sense of where things are going as it relates to George Santos tonight?
It's not common, but it's also not necessarily likely to happen, at least not tonight, because the two-thirds majority is really important, and it's not clear, according to my unofficial count, that the Republicans actually have the votes from within their own ranks to expel Santos from Congress. But if you look at what's going on the floor right now, Hallie, it's just really, really awkward. There's no other way to put this. You've got the three New York freshman Republicans. You've got Mike Lawler there at the mics right now, but Lolota and Esposito are behind him. They are detailing why they want to kick their fellow New York Republican out of Congress, partly for some of the reasons you listed, but also because of the ongoing investigations into him and the fact that they just don't want someone who's a fraudulent candidate that got elected into office on a fraudulent resume being their colleague here in the House. So we're watching them do that. But then we're also watching George Santos himself be in the chamber and continue to defer his time to speak. You see him right there in the red. Very easy to spot today.
Does he have to be there?
He doesn't have to be there, but he is, I think, going to be defending himself. And so when we see him standing at the mic saying that he reserves his time, and then you watch it go back to the people who are basically maligning him in front of him on the House floor, it's Santos reserving his time to, at the end of this, defend himself in some way, shape, or form on the House floor. We don't know what he's going to say. He just tweeted that he's, quote unquote, fine and calm. That's the status update that he gave, but it seems he's talking now. Maybe he's doing the defense of himself as we speak.
Does he have any friends, Allie? And I mean that congressionally. Like, does he have any allies here? If it's not the members from his state, which clearly it's not, who's backing him?
Very few people. I don't know that many are going to be willing to put their hands up and say, I support Santos, but that's not what they're voting on today. What they're voting on is expelling him from Congress. You don't have to have friends or no friends to not get expelled from Congress. And the reason for that is because we know Republican majorities are already so slim. If they were to expel Santos, they're already down one more. It's why Kevin McCarthy, when he was Speaker, was trying to slow walk this process. It's why Mike Johnson is kind of not slow walking it, but not exactly thrilled at the prospect of expelling one member and having one less member in his Republican ranks. And also, if there were a special election called, which there would be in New York as soon as this guy is expelled, that seat would likely turn blue just because of all of the scandal associated with Santos and the Republican Party in this part of Long Island. So it wouldn't just be Republicans losing a seat. It would probably be them losing it in the long term for the Congress.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head here, Allie. So exactly what I was going to bring up with you, the idea that there are real implications here for the next election cycle, too. Allie, we are watching, of course, Congressman Santos appeared to defend himself at this moment. I'm going to let you listen in. We're going to ask you to come back, give us an update when there is an update to be given. Thank you, friend. Appreciate it. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, dozens of Afghans illegally living in Pakistan are being deported to Afghanistan, where the Taliban's in charge. This is after the Pakistani government said it would arrest and deport nearly 2 million unregistered or undocumented foreigners, mostly Afghans, which the UN says could cause a human rights catastrophe. Number 2, the second person to get a pig heart transplant has died, according to his doctors. He was dying of heart failure and not eligible for traditional transplant when he got this experimental surgery back in September. Doctors say the heart seemed healthy for the first month and then started showing signs of rejection. They're going to try to look into what happened and keep researching animal to human organ transplants. Number 3, new guidance tonight from the American Cancer Society saying millions more people should end up screened for lung cancer every year. That includes heavy smokers who quit more than 15 years ago. So even if you used to smoke but stopped a decade plus ago, you should get screened. Experts say the risk of lung cancer goes up as people get older, even if they gave up smoking a long time before. Number 4, a former Delta pilot has been indicted for allegedly threatening to shoot a captain during a flight. He apparently didn't want the captain to divert the flight because of a medical problem with the passenger, and the indictment says he used a dangerous weapon. Number 5, country music superstar Jason Aldean is defending that controversial video, Try That in a Small Town. Remember that? We told you about it. This was a couple months ago now. It shows things like the American flag burning in a place where a black teenager was lynched about a century ago. Here's what Aldean is telling CBS.
I feel like the narrative really got switched over and became, more of a racial type thing. That's like, if that's what you got out of the song and the video, I mean, I almost kind of feel like that's on you because that wasn't our intention.
Aldean says he never expected the backlash. when we come back. At least one person has died after a coal plant collapse in Kentucky. What we know now about a second worker trapped inside and the race against time to rescue him. Plus, interest rates are going to stay the same, at least for now, we're learning. We're looking for some clues about the health of the economy out of the Fed meeting today. That's coming up next. The stock market closing up today after the Fed decided to leave interest rates alone for the second straight time in a row. So markets seem to like that. And even though this guy, Jay Powell, the Fed chair, says he doesn't see any signs of a recession in the near future. Yay. He says the Fed is committed to getting inflation down to 2% and implied that perhaps another increase is still on the table, maybe in December, maybe later. At the same time, it's a kind of split screen because President Biden is out in Minnesota today to try to win over more votes in rural America, a part of the country that we know has been hit hard by inflation over the last couple of years. He's announcing more than $5 billion in spending to help adapt agriculture to climate change, to get more high-speed internet access out there, et cetera. Gabe Gutierrez is in Minnesota with more on that and the president in just a second. But I want to start with Brian Chung, who's covering all things Fed. It's so interesting to me every time we do this. Totally expected that he wasn't going to raise interest rates. Cool if you're trying to get a new mortgage, right? The interesting thing is the way that people parse his remarks around what's going to happen 2 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, right? What's the big takeaway tonight?
Yeah, it does feel like Groundhog Day sometimes because it's like, okay, well, they didn't do anything. And that's the news, that the Fed didn't do anything. They kept interest rates the same, which they had done in the previous meeting as well. But that says a lot because the Fed had been doing this aggressive interest rate hiking over the last year and a half. You recall in the this time last year, they were raising interest rates at 3/4 of a percentage point at a time. And the reason for why is inflation, inflation, inflation. That's what's hurting Americans at the store. And indeed, inflation has come down from the pace of 9% annually last year to 3.7% as of the last read. The Fed really wants to see that somewhere closer to 2%. But they say they don't have to continue to raise interest rates to get to that point. They can just keep them steady. But that still means high mortgage rates, 8% we're seeing in some cases. And because they're not cutting rates, there's no reason to think those will go down anytime soon, Hallie.
Well, that was my question, is what does it mean for, like, all of us regular folk out here, right? Like, is the mortgage piece is always a big part of this when it comes to the interest rates here? No expectation those are going to go down anytime soon, or do we just not know?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Federal Reserve Chairman was saying right now the decision is whether or not they want to raise interest rates again in December. They're not talking or thinking about cutting interest rates. And because credit card rates, which, by the way, are around 21, 22% right now, and mortgage rates somewhere between 7 and 8% right now, well, that means that those rates won't go down because the Fed's not talking about cutting interest rates. So it's still a pretty tough time to be missing any sort of payments right now.
Brian Chung, thank you so much. That tees us up nicely for Gabe Gutierrez, because, Gabe, what do we know that voters care about year after year consistently? It is the economy, right? That is so much when I talk to folks around the White House and close to the president that they talk about when it comes to 2024. You are seeing that firsthand yourself on the ground there today, because we know that inflation has really hit some of these rural voters that the president is trying to appeal to hard.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hallie. We spoke with one farmer in Iowa today who was saying exactly that inflation has been up significantly in the last couple of years. And yes, it is on its way down, but it still has affected this farmer in Iowa in terms of costs for fuel, for food, and really affecting his business quite a bit. And with that in mind, President Biden came here to Minnesota to speak with rural voters here. And he's kicking off a 2-week blitz, not just him, but cabinet secretaries, senior administration officials, as they recognize that over the last couple of years, Hallie, Republicans have made a lot of gains when it comes to rural voters. Former President Trump over the last 2 presidential elections, and also Republicans in the 2022 midterms, now making up 69% of the rural vote. Today, as you said, the president touting an extra $5 billion in federal funding for rural communities, the administration says, to help create jobs and expand access to broadband. Take a listen to part of the speech that President Biden gave, wrapped up just a short time ago here in this barn in Northfield. Take a listen.
When the middle class does well, the poor have a way up, and the wealthy still do very well. When rural America does well, when Indian country does well, we all do well.
Again, this is so high stakes, Hallie, because according to researchers at Cornell University, dating back to the year 2000, 94% of the job growth in this country has actually come from urban counties. So certainly this is something that the Biden administration, the Biden campaign, wants to pay a lot of attention to over the next year or so, Hallie.
When you talk about Minnesota, too, there is another element to what's happening globally that is significant here, and that is, of course, that Israel-Hamas war that we started the show talking about here. You saw Muslim and Arab community leaders holding a news conference, essentially. They are urging the United States to back more of a ceasefire right now, something that both U.S. officials and Israeli officials have said is simply not going to happen after that terror attack in early October. Talk us through some of that and the implications there.
Yeah, Hallie, this is something that could prove significant as we head into the 2024, presidential campaign ramping up. We have now heard it over the last several weeks in places like Michigan and actually here in Minnesota. I spent the day yesterday speaking with Jewish Americans, but also Palestinian Americans, and the Palestinian Americans especially. They were furious with the Biden administration for not supporting that ceasefire in Gaza at this point. So we were speaking with some of those voters. Leaders had set a deadline yesterday here in Minnesota for the Biden administration to change its course. Of course, that did not happen. There were some small demonstrations here during the president's visit as well. But I want to play for you some of that interview with a local Palestinian American leader about his response to how the Biden administration has handled this. Take a listen.
When we see the Democratic Party right now is dehumanizing the Palestinian, like Biden the other day said, I don't trust the number of people dead that comes from Gaza. You don't have to have the exact number, Mr. President, but you have to have some empathy. And for him losing that empathy, I am done with Biden. I'm not voting Biden.
You know what was incredible, Hallie? The thinking among some of these Muslim Americans that, yes, that perhaps they may stay home. Some of them, though, actually said that they would consider voting for former President Trump because, in their words, at least things were more peaceful under his administration. So think of that is just incredible when you think about it. A former president who supported the Muslim ban at this point. They are so furious with the Biden administration that they would even consider voting for former President Trump at this point. Hallie.
Gabe Gutierrez live for us there in Minnesota, traveling with President Biden. Gabe, thank you. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because it can be tough to read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Southern Bureau, police in Tampa, down in Florida, say they've seized enough fentanyl to kill 5 million people. This was part of a weeks-long investigation and the biggest seizure in the history of the Tampa area. The sheriff's office says 3 people have been arrested on multiple charges. Out of our Western Bureau, teachers in Portland public schools say they will strike for the first time after the union and the district couldn't come to terms on a new contract. The strike is going to shut down school for about 45,000 students in that state's biggest city. The union wants more money for teachers, a cap on class sizes, and more resources generally. Out of our Northeast Bureau, folks, that time of year again. Feast your eyes on the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree for this year, 80 feet tall, 12 tons. It's from Vestal, New York. It's going to arrive at 30 Rock at Rockefeller Plaza on November 11th. The lighting is November 29th. Huge rescue operation is happening as we speak, with the governor declaring a state of emergency. That's because officials say at least one person was killed. Another is still missing after a coal preparation plant, more than 100 feet tall, collapsed on top of them. You can see that footage right there. Our Noah Pransky has this race against time rescue.
Tonight, a race against time after tragedy in rural Kentucky.
A structural collapse has 2 individuals trapped in steel and concrete.
Workers pinned inside an 11-story coal preparation plant after the building collapsed.
As of right now, the situation doesn't look good.
One worker perished, county and state officials confirmed at a press conference today, and now a rescue mission underway to find the other. The collapse happened around 6:30 p.m. Tuesday, according to Kentucky Emergency Management, at the decommissioned Martin Mine Prep plant located near the border with West Virginia. The Martin County judge executive saying the men were at the bottom floor at the time working to prepare the building for demolition when it collapsed, pinning them under tons of concrete and steel. Rescuers got in contact with one of the workers following the collapse, but say he died during the attempt to save him. Now the search for the other continues.
We've talked with both of the families. It's never an easy thing. It's the toughest part of the job, but something that has to be done.
Kentucky's Governor Andy Beshear declaring a state of emergency in a tweet telling Kentuckians to brace for the worst, saying, "Keep praying, but the scene is bad, and we should be prepared for tough news out of Martin County." For now, emergency responders still holding out hope they can rescue one survivor trapped under piles of twisted steel and rubble.
Noah is joining us now. Do we have any sense of why this plant collapsed in the first place?
No, not yet. The Kentucky State Police have launched an investigation, so they're looking into it, but they say it's too early to tell. As of this point, they're also now still considering this a rescue mission, not recovery. They're using cadaver dogs and heavy machinery, but no good news yet much of today, so hope a little bit diminishing in eastern Kentucky. Hallie?
Noah Pransky, thank you. Still to come here on the show, the New York Times digging into Ye, formerly Kanye West's almost decades-long partnership with Adidas, and found the company looked past misconduct for years before cutting ties with him. Our backstory tonight is with the reporter behind that scoop. Do not miss it. That's coming up. Time now to get the backstory. Our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. Tonight, what the New York Times is calling the fullest accounting of Adidas' relationship with Ye, the rapper who used to go by Kanye West, before the company dropped him last year over his anti-Semitic and offensive comments. But behind the scenes, the Times reports, Adidas had been tolerating his misconduct for nearly a decade. It started in 2013 at the company's German headquarters when Adidas was pitching ideas to Ye for the first shoe they would make together. But two people in the meeting tell the paper Ye was not really into those ideas. And to show that, he reportedly grabbed a sketch of one shoe and drew a swastika on it. The Times also reporting that weeks before that, at a different meeting, Ye made Adidas executives watch porn to, quote, spark creativity. And that later he told a Jewish Adidas manager to kiss a picture of Hitler every day. While all of that was happening, there were conversations internally, according to this Times investigation, about how to make Ye happy, as the shoes were making the company millions of dollars every year, with internal company documents saying that the, quote, biggest issue is putting cash in Kanye's pocket to show how much it valued his impact on the brand, quote unquote. That was in March 2016. Eventually, things turned into what Adidas leadership called a code red, according to a group chat in October 19 of Adidas leadership, after West said in a text to executives that he wasn't going to ask for things that he says were owed to him, writing, and I'm quoting here, "This relationship dynamic changes now," per the Times. Now, Adidas still did not end things until late last year after, remember, the comments Ye made targeting Jewish people and the Black Lives Matter movement. We've reached out to Adidas. We haven't heard back yet. But in a statement to the Times, they say the company has no tolerance for hate speech and offensive behavior, which is why the company terminated the Adidas-Yeezy partnership. Ye has not responded to requests for comments from NBC News or the Times. Megan Toohey, who reported the story out for the Times, is joining us now. Megan, extraordinary details in this story. You actually traveled to get this all nailed together to Portland, to L.A. You did interviews with Adidas, with current and former employees of Ye. Hundreds of internal records you had to sift through here. The depth and the detail here just hasn't been reported before. Pull back the curtain for us here, because that's what this segment is all about. Talk about your process. Talk about what started you down this path in the first place.
Yeah, so, I mean, it was almost exactly 1 year ago that Adidas broke ties with Kanye West as he was making these anti-Semitic and other public inflammatory comments. And, you know, I realized that this was an extremely lucrative partnership, the Yeezy partnership that they were in for 10 years. They made billions of dollars. They put out more than 250 shoe styles of these Yeezys. I mean, it really pushed the boundaries of celebrity endorsement deals. And I wanted to know, I had some questions that went beyond the headlines last year. I wanted to know, was the behavior that we saw from Kanye West last fall indicative of a broader pattern of behavior or misbehavior? And if so, what did Adidas know? And when did they know it? And what did they do about it? So that's what set me off on this reporting track that involved traveling to Portland, traveling to LA, sort of slowly but surely getting people who had worked on this collaboration to talk to me, and then very significantly obtaining hundreds of internal, previously undisclosed records, text messages, contracts, internal company memos, and financial records that allowed me to slowly but surely to kind of piece together the behind-the-scenes story of this partnership and how this company tolerated misconduct for years in pursuit of celebrity and profit.
Given that Ye had already publicly made these just offensive anti-Semitic comments and that was known at the point that you started reporting this out, was it easier or harder than you expected to get some of these people in that orbit, in the Adidas orbit, to talk to you?
Yeah, it was really difficult. Keep in mind that everybody who worked for Adidas and also for Mr. West on this collaboration had to sign multiple NDAs. And even though Kanye West had this public implosion of sorts last fall, he wasn't seen as being completely gone from the cultural world. I mean, I would say I'm not alone. I think a lot of people see him as being arguably one of the most powerful cultural figures in the world, somebody who has a tremendous track record of coming back from controversy. So there was a lot of fear among people about what it would mean to speak out. And that's why, getting these internal company records was so significant, because I was actually able, through those records, to see what Adidas executives and employees were saying and doing behind the scenes as this relationship was unfolding in real time.
People may be, if you're not a sneakerhead, let me preface by saying you may be surprised, and you talked about this, at the many, many, many kinds of sneakers and partnerships here of Yeezy shoes that came out over the course of this relationship between Ye and Adidas here. I wonder, and by the way, apparently Ye is still making some money from this. Was there anything, Megan, that surprised you through the course of the reporting? Was there anything that you really stopped and went, wow, I did not expect that piece of it?
Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, I didn't have an appreciation for just how massively successful this partnership was. The fact that it had stretched for 10 years, the fact that they made billions of dollars together. Kanye West ended up making much more money from these Yeezy sneakers, from this collaboration, that he did from his music. And it was also a way by which, Adidas started to financially resurrect itself in this hyper-competitive sneaker industry. It had long been trailing behind Nike, which has this extremely successful Michael Jordan, these Jordans that had really catapulted them to the top. And so I guess I was surprised to learn how significant and successful this partnership had been for both Adidas and Kanye, but then also how much conduct had happened behind the scenes and the links that Adidas went to basically accept and accommodate his behavior over the years as they became more and more dependent on profits. And you're right, it stretched right back to that one of the very first meetings at Adidas headquarters in Germany when he drew that swastika, and it unfolded from there.
Megan, I know we're running out of time here, but in case people are going, wait a second, Megan Twohey, why do I know that name? It's because you worked on so many just incredible pieces of investigative journalism. People know, I think, the Harvey Weinstein story that you were part of breaking. You were one of the first journalists to get on the story of untested rape kits, for example. When you're taking these hugely important and sprawling stories, Megan, can you give us some insight into your process of how you begin to go about that? Not just for this one, but pulling back more broadly over the course of the last many years for you here.
Yeah, well, listen, I think that and when we were reporting the Harvey Weinstein story in 2017, ultimately we realized that we weren't just kind of tracking and documenting the behavior of one bad man, that there were a lot of individuals and institutions that glimpsed this misbehavior and tolerated it and were complicit. And I think that that's always like a driving question that fuels my work, is not just the sort of individual bad actors, but how entire companies can come to tolerate misconduct and even become complicit in it.
Megan Twohey, we're so glad to have you on. Thank you very much for giving us a glimpse into the behind-the-scenes process for you. Appreciate it. That does it for us for this hour. We've got a lot more coverage picking up right now. We are coming on the air tonight with the first group of people trapped in Gaza now evacuating from the war zone. What we're learning about how this deal came to be and what comes next for the hundreds of others waiting their turn as another Israeli airstrike devastates a refugee camp in Gaza. Plus, Donald Trump Jr. on the stand testifying in the fraud case against his father. We are outside court with the vibe check. And tonight, controversial Congressman George Santos, he is out on the House floor as we speak, defending himself, defending his seat, even as his colleagues debate kicking him out of office over lying to voters. We've got the latest from the Hill. Then the fate of the former king of crypto will soon be in the hands of a jury in Sam Bankman-Fried's historic fraud trial. What we're hearing in closing arguments today and what we expect to see tomorrow. Plus, the Fed chair saying he sees no sign of recession in the near future as President Biden tries to win over rural voters hit hard by inflation. A look at where the country's economy stands coming up in just a sec. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and tonight a new glimmer of hope in Gaza with the first civilians now evacuating, the very first to make it out of Gaza since the Israel-Hamas war started. Look at this. You see it here. Video into us showing people crowding around the Rafah border crossing. We've talked about this before, this crossing. It's right on the border with Egypt. You had dozens of people hurt and leaving, crossing into Egypt in ambulances. Other people, look at that. People have their suitcases, their luggage with them. They cross through an open gate. 500 foreigners, including a handful of Americans, are also set to evacuate, according to a source briefed on negotiations. Listen to what some of the people getting out are telling our team after this new deal came through, brokered by the Qataris and the Americans. Watch.
We are relying on God and hoping we get out. It is still our country and we feel sad for it, for its destruction, for our friends and loved ones. Entire families were destroyed and erased, all martyred. If it wasn't for what happened, we wouldn't leave it.
It comes as we are just learning now that dozens of people may be trapped under debris right now after a second strike hit a refugee camp near Gaza City today, just 24 hours after an Israeli airstrike on that same camp, killing dozens of people and fueling new anger about the cost this war is having on civilians, with conditions getting more and more desperate. The context here, the backdrop, look at this, the intensifying fight. Multiple rockets here fired from northern Gaza toward Israel, as the Israelis are now sending more tanks toward Gaza. The military says they're hitting more Hamas command centers and that they killed 2 top leaders of Hamas in the last 24 hours, promising that there will be a next phase of this war after that horrific terror attack against Israel by Hamas on October 7th. I want to bring in Hallie, who is on the ground for us live in Tel Aviv. So, Hallie, in just the last, I want to say 90 minutes or so, we've heard from President Biden on these brand new evacuations today, the civilians who are now able, the foreigners, to get out of Gaza. Let me play a little bit of that here.
Today, thanks to concerted American leadership, we're in a situation where safe passage for wounded Palestinians and foreign nationals to exit Gaza has started. The American citizens are able to exit today as part of the first group of probably over 1,000.
You heard the president say it there. Some Americans were able, he says, or are able to evacuate now. Significant here in this moment. What do we know about this deal to get these civilians out and the really important role that the Qataris are playing?
Yeah, the Qataris are playing a mediating role. They have been since October 7th. One of my sources briefed on the talks has said that essentially there is a deal to allow up to 500 people a day, though we're hearing from the State Department that that number may be higher. Today, 335 foreign nationals were able to cross over. 76 critically injured Palestinians were loaded onto ambulances and driven to either field hospitals or hospitals deeper into Egypt for further treatment. You can imagine what a relief it is for them and their families, because hospitals, as many of our viewers know, are running out of fuel and in some cases running out of morphine and not able to conduct surgery on people who need it, especially complex cases. Only a handful of Americans, you mentioned, out of the 335 today. The expectation, though, is that we'll see many more cross over, but today only about 5, we understand, including one, Ramona Okumura, who is a prosthetics specialist based in the state of Washington. She's retired. She had made several trips with a charity into the Gaza Strip and was one of the U.S. citizens released today. She has been sending voice notes to her family, and this is some of what she told them as she made her way out. Listen.
Please ask yourself, how many of us 500 Americans stuck here in Gaza and 1 million Palestinian children must die before this war ends?
All right, that is Ramona Okumura, one of a handful of Americans. But as I said, Hallie, more U.S. citizens are expected to make their way out there. 400 who've expressed the desire to do so. So we'll be keeping an eye on that.
You have been covering so much on the diplomatic piece of this, Hala, and we are hearing more fallout on that front over these strikes on the refugee camp in Gaza. Walk us through that and how that fits into concerns, as we've talked about here, that this war could broaden into something bigger regionally.
Well, so far, we're not seeing a military conflagration, but we're seeing diplomatic. I'm looking down here at my notes because I want to get the quotes exactly right for you. Even the UN Human Rights Commission is saying that given the high number of civilian casualties in that first Jabaliya refugee camp strike yesterday, the destruction following that airstrike on the camp, we have serious concerns that these are disproportionate attacks that could amount to war crimes. These are the words of the United Nations. And Jordan, Israel's neighbor, of course, that signed a normalization deal with Israel many decades ago, is recalling its ambassador, not specifically mentioning Jabaliya, but saying essentially that the assault on Gaza is disproportionate and it is something that it cannot accept. This Jabaliya refugee camp strike really has caused massive consternation around the region. People have been shocked. They say even if there is a Hamas commander somewhere in there, to drop that type of bomb and several bombs, I should say several strikes on the camp, is disproportionate and killing civilians in a disproportionate way. So this is something that has really angered people in this part of the world, Hallie.
Hala Garani, thank you very much for that reporting live for us there from national security analyst Clint Watts now, who is posted up at the big board for us. And Clint, you heard Ellison talking about it, right? The strike on this refugee camp here. How does it fit into military operations as they stand now and as they are predicted and expected to stand in the days to come?
That's right, Hallie. If we just take a look at what's happened over the last week, several things. One, 6 days ago, 2 breach points here and here. The Israeli military setting up what is an assembly area, which they are now using to advance in multiple columns down this area closer to the beach, while also coming down here to Johor, where there's been a lot of combat operations, and up this main street where they've created a blocking position trying to prevent Hamas militants moving north to south. They've also moved in here over to the northeast, set up another assembly area, and what you can see them doing is setting up battle positions to seal off the town. But that doesn't speak to actually what's going on in terms of airstrikes. What we've been talking about is airstrikes that have happened in different areas around Jabaliya, but also around all of North Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces say they're striking targets with underground bunkers, caves, hitting Hamas leaders. The Palestinians who are trapped here in Gaza, they're saying something very different, that these refugee camps and innocent women and children are being struck.
You're an expert in this, Clint, so talk about urban warfare, right? I mean, we know that Gaza, the area that you've shown here, the Strip, is so densely packed. I mean, it is very, very condensed here. And we know that the Israelis have said that Hamas uses civilians as, in their words, human shields, essentially. There's a real impact on the lives of innocent people who are not, fighting on behalf of Hamas here.
Hallie, it's the worst case scenario. Urban warfare, particularly in this zone here, you're talking about just a matter of 5 miles wide at times, or only 2 miles in. This area is extremely dense. If you look at where these airstrikes hit, and you can tell based on the cone, essentially, of these pictures and the way it is struck into here, they are going after something that is potentially underground and deep. And the Israeli Defense Forces would say, we're going after Hamas leaders who are operating from underground bunkers, which could be true. We don't know, and we haven't verified. But at the same point, in this kind of a density, you're going to have women, children, civilians killed. Urban warfare, it's the worst kind of warfare to try and navigate and be surgical and restore the peace.
Clint Watts, thank you so much for that breakdown. It's illuminating, for sure. Appreciate it. An extraordinary moment just wrapping up in New York court today with Donald Trump Jr. taking the stand in that massive civil tax fraud case against his father, the case in which prosecutors are accusing the former president of lying about how much he was actually worth.
Don, will you come talk to us? How's it going?
So there you see Don Jr., as he's called, walking away saying, hey, I can't talk to you, basically walking out of court, didn't stop and take questions, but he sure did take questions on the stand. This is him right beforehand. You see him kind of smiling here. He joked around that he should have worn makeup. During questioning, he seemed fairly relaxed, with he and the judge even joking back and forth. Donald Trump Jr. is just the first in what is going to be an essentially parade of adult children taking the stand. Eric Trump later in the week, that's expected, and then next week, the former president and his daughter Ivanka Trump. And Dad is not happy about any of it, with Mr. Trump posting, "Leave my children alone," and to the judge, "You are disgrace to the legal profession." Lindsay Reiser is joining us now from outside court. According to our team in court, it seemed like Trump Jr. was pretty relaxed, but he hasn't been cross-examined yet by prosecutors. That is where we expect things to potentially get kind of spicy, right?
Well, right now, he is in direct examination by prosecutors. He is right now, Hallie, the state's witness. And so we know that we are expecting cross-examination soon. That will be by the defense team. Now, let me sort of summarize a little bit of the testimony so far. He has been testifying to the nature of his titles and involvement in the Trump organization. And that includes in some of these properties that they acquired through loans that they would then develop into hotels. And remember, it is those statements of financial condition that were used to get those loans that the Attorney General's office alleges included favorable terms that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten had they not overvalued their assets. I want to go into a little bit more about some of the direct examination here, a little bit more of the back and forth. So I'm going to read a little bit from our notes from the producer inside the courtroom. Donald Trump Jr. was asked whether he was familiar with GAD, the generally accepted accounting principles. He said he learned about it in Accounting 101. Hallie, in his deposition, he had joked that the only thing he knew about it was that they were generally accepted. And he seemed to point the finger at Donald Bender with Mazars. That was the main accounting firm that they used for many, many years. And also with Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO of the Trump Organization, Hallie.
It's a big deal, right, to have the former president's adult children here testifying here. I mean, there's a lot at stake.
Absolutely. An extraordinary moment here, really setting up for potentially days of blockbuster testimony. And this is really what is at stake. The entire business empire, they made their names here in New York, and whether or not they can run businesses here in New York is at stake. We can expect to hear after from Eric Trump and then from the former president himself on Monday, followed by Ivanka Trump, who is no longer a co-defendant, on Wednesday. But certainly there is a lot at stake, Hallie, including potentially up to $250 million. That's the damages that the Attorney General's office is asking for in this case, Hallie.
Lindsay Reiser, thank you so much. Appreciate it. The fate of the former king of crypto is about to be in the hands of the 12 jurors who have spent the past month sitting just feet away from Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF, in his historic fraud trial. It sounds like deliberations are probably going to start tomorrow, as the defense has just wrapped up their closing arguments. The defense, SBF's lawyers, they say the government is turning him into a monster and that bad business decisions that led to the downfall of his company, FTX, are not a crime. But the prosecution earlier reminded the jury that SBF said, "I can't recall," more than 140 times in his testimony. And they brought up the thousands of people who lost billions of dollars when FTX collapsed, all while Bankman-Fried was tweeting everything was fine. SBF faces a potential life sentence if he's convicted on these fraud charges tied to both FTX and his hedge fund, Alameda Research, which crumbled last year. He has pleaded not guilty. Kate Rooney is joining us now. She's been covering this trial for us. So, Kate, it sounds like things are just wrapping up. Where does it stand? Does the jury get charged? Does the jury take this up tomorrow now?
Yes, we're going to get a rebuttal tomorrow, first thing tomorrow, Hallie, and then the jury will get charged. They'll get the reading of all of these charges, which it's about 60 pages. The judge goes through line for line, so that should be a dry couple of hours compared to what we've heard in the past few days here with Sam Bankman-Fried's testimony, and then what we got today with closing arguments, which the prosecution really tried to chalk up to greed, fraud. They tried to simplify it and say he was the smartest guy in the room. There is no way that this guy was ignorant of what was going on at his crypto exchange. They tried to tell the jury that. They said he lied to you on the stand and have tried to make it a simple case of fraud, while the defense has claimed he didn't know what was going on. He made some business mistakes, absolutely, but that does not mean he committed a crime.
And we've talked about this, Kate, and I think this so encapsulates it, the idea that the word of the week is evasive, right? That the prosecution has tried to paint Sam Bankman-Fried as kind of evasive about this. Like I don't remember, I don't know. The judge didn't seem to love that. The defense has pushed back on that too. Do you have any sense, and this is a tough question, so I didn't want to ask it. I was going to say any sense of how it plays with the jury, but maybe more importantly, any sense of the way that could play into this more broadly?
Yeah, that is one big thing legal experts say that it's key. The jury's not only watching your words, they're watching things like your body language. They're trying to decide if you're credible and they believe you. And things like evading a question and getting scolded by the judge absolutely weigh on that. And we'll see where it ends up when the jury does go and decide this. But absolutely plays into things like body language and just your credibility. So not a great sign for Bankman-Fried there.
What's also interesting is it used to be thought of that, like, if you took the stand in your own defense, that was a risk. That was potentially extremely risky. Yeah. But we have seen an increasing number of these high-profile defendants do just that. Risks be damned, if you will.
He is a risk taker by nature. Cryptocurrency is about the riskiest pocket of financial markets you can find. He was a high-frequency trader, and he's kind of known for taking risks. So in that sense, not surprising. And the other legal experts have said that this was sort of a last-ditch effort. He had his top lieutenants, his former girlfriend, his two best friends, and really his C-suite of his executive team testify against him. In some senses, he may have had no choice. The jury would have wanted to hear from him. But you are seeing that happen increasingly. You think of Elizabeth Holmes testifying in the Theranos case. But he is someone who likes to take on risk and may also think that he can explain this away, that if I can just get up there and talk to the jury and tell them what happened, he, in some ways, was able to charm investors, charm the media, charm a lot of people in his life. So he may be betting that he can do that one more time and charm the jury here, Hallie.
Kate Rooney. We'll find out, and we may find out pretty soon. Kate, thank you. We'll talk again. We got a little bit of breaking news into us from here in Washington. Finally, a move now from a group of senators to try to maybe confirm dozens of military promotions that have been held up by one of their colleagues. You probably know this story. Senator Tommy Tuberville. He's been blocking promotions for months over his objections to the reproductive rights policy of the Department of Defense. I want to get to Julie Sirkin in Capitol Hill. Just to contact, this has been a huge issue, I think, for a lot of people in the Senate, because this blockage essentially is preventing military officers from getting promotions. It's slowing the process down, et cetera. Now, there may finally be a move to speed things up. Where does this go? What's happening?
Well, literally right now as we speak, Hallie, on the Senate floor, Senator Sullivan, who is a former Marine, he's a Republican from Alaska, he's taking to the Senate floor with some of his colleagues to try and move along unanimously a whole host of military promotions. 115 nominees, part of that 300-plus bucket that have been held up by Senator Tuberville since February for 9 months. The thing is, though, despite Sullivan's strong feelings on this, earlier he used an expletive I can't necessarily repeat on television, it's not likely going anywhere because Senator Tuberville himself is planning to object to this unanimous consent request. You see it there on your screen from Sullivan, from Graham, from other senators like Joni Ernst, who also has a military background. These people, these senators, really feel so closely to this issue, especially in light of what happened to Eric Smith, the Marine commandant who suffered that heart attack last week. Now, where does this go from here? The unanimous consent request, while a huge major step, this is happening from Republicans, is going to go down. That means they're still going to look at a potential rules change. Majority Leader Schumer just a couple of minutes ago said he's looking to put that on the floor. That will require the support of around 10 Republicans. I'm told there might be some openness there, though, because of the frustration felt on all sides of the issue here.
Julie Sirkin, sounds like it's going to be a late night for you and your colleagues there on the Hill yet again. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. A Cornell student's being held without bail tonight for allegedly making online threats to Jewish students at his school. Patrick Day, charged with posting threats online to kill or hurt fellow students. And I have to warn you here, these threats are disturbing. They are horrific because the complaint alleges Day posted to an online discussion board threatening to shoot up a campus building, that he would stab or slit the throat of Jewish men on campus and rape Jewish women before throwing them off a cliff. In an interview with the FBI, Day admits to making the posts. Cornell, in a statement, says they remain shocked and condemn these horrific anti-Semitic threats. It is concerns about that kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, the concern about increasing numbers of the potential for attacks that seem to have more Jewish Americans thinking about how to defend themselves if it came to that. To the point some gun instructors and Jewish security groups across the country say they've been flooded with new clients ever since the Hamas attack October 7th.
Flat? Okay, not bad. Again?
You see it here in South Florida, where this gun shop owner used to offer his training maybe a couple times a week, once or twice. Now he's offering it once or twice per day. Out west in L.A., a rabbi who runs self-defense and firearm training classes for the Jewish community says he's gotten 600 calls in just a week, telling us we can't put down the phone without picking up the next one. I want to bring in NBC's Sam Brock. And Sam, as you have been talking to folks here, it's not something people necessarily want to do, but you found they feel like they tell you they need to do it.
It's perfectly captured, Hallie. I mean, I would say almost to a person. When I spoke with people and I said, is this something that you're comfortable with? They said, no, I absolutely do not want to be doing this, but I have to do it. I feel compelled to do it with the explosion of anti-Semitic sentiment and incidents that we're tracking, not just in South Florida, but of course across the country. But there are plenty of them in South Florida. These moms that I'm speaking with, and I should say there are groups for men and women and couples. We happen to tag along here as we saw grandmothers, basically, and moms describe to me what they've seen in their own neighborhoods with graffiti saying "Free Gaza" and "Kill all Jews." Another woman saying her neighbor had a note slipped underneath her door which said, "You will die because you're Jewish." I mean, this is happening in real time. And many of these women said they had thought about potentially getting a firearm over the course of years. But this right now, this atmosphere and environment pushed them over the threshold to feel like they were compelled to do it. Take a listen to some of the things they told me on the firing range. This was only a couple of days ago.
We want to be able to use it properly and feel protected and be able to protect our children, our loved ones in our home if we ever need it.
It's scary. It's a powerful tool, and I hope never to be in a situation where it's around me or I need to use it.
The first woman that we just saw there standing in front of AR-15 style rifles is the wife of a rabbi who also helps to manage a preschool, and she has 7 children. This is the profile apparently now of those who are looking to get armed, and that is scary.
It's also not just in South Florida, Sam. I mean, that's where you are. That's where you talk to people there. But this is not isolated to just one particular community.
Definitely not. This is Florida. This is New York. It's Chicago. It's Los Angeles. It's all over the country. I know you referenced earlier that we spoke with a rabbi out in L.A. who runs a very similar type of program, a holistic one. And he said not just 600 calls in 1 week, but he had a meeting where he was expecting a few dozen people and 250 showed up. He said they are trying to tread water right now, Hallie, just to get the staffing to help all of the people who want to be trained in firearms.
Sam Brock, thank you very much for that reporting. It is important, and we appreciate you bringing it to us. We've got a lot more coming up here on the show, including controversial Congressman George Santos defending himself on the House floor as his colleagues try to have him kicked out. And Apple set to face a big lawsuit in London now. Why the company is being accused of knowingly adding bad batteries to certain phones. A controversial congressman could end up kicked out of office, or at least be one step closer to that tonight. We are talking about George Santos, who not too long ago took to the House floor to try to defend himself against a vote that could happen in the next couple of hours. Listen to this.
I must warn my colleagues that voting for expulsion at this point would circumvent the judicial system's right to due process that I'm entitled to, and desanctify the long-held premise that one is presumed innocent until proven guilty.
Santos has admitted to lying or misleading constituents, voters, about a whole bunch of things. He said he graduated from college, including NYU, then said he actually did not graduate from any college. He's claimed to have extensive Wall Street experience, said he worked for Citigroup or Goldman Sachs. Neither company has any record of him working there. So now his job's on the line, basically, including, of course, some of the other charges he faces. Removing a sitting congressman, that doesn't happen often at all. It's very rare. It has only happened 5 times in history. If it were to happen, it would mean the Republican Party, the GOP, would have an even slimmer, razor-thin majority than it already has. Hallie Vitale is joining us now. Hallie, did you catch up with Congressman Santos? I know there's lots of hallway action there. What did he say to you? Where does this go tonight?
Right place, right time, Hallie, because my colleague Kyle Stewart and I were walking down to the outside the House floor. We were wondering if Congressman Santos might come out, and lo and behold, there he was right as we arrived in the hallway. I think one of the things that I asked him immediately was how it felt to stand there by himself without any of his colleagues backing him up as his job is on the line and his colleagues from New York are threatening to expel him from Congress. He said that he didn't ask anyone to stand up and speak for him, that this is his fight to fight alone, and that he would continue doing so. He also tried to level a claim that this was rich or ironic, given the fact that it was coming from fellow New York Republicans. I asked him to expand on that. Did he mean that his fellow colleagues should also be under investigation? He didn't expand or give any allegations to that. But of course, I pointed out the fact that He is the only one right now who is under active investigation and facing indictments. At the end of the day, though, he said that this was water off a duck's back and that he was prepared to continue to fight for his job.
The politics around this, right? I mean, the person who introduced this resolution in the first place is a Republican from New York, but there are implications not just in the short term, but in the longer term, too, if this seat were to go poof for George Santos.
Exactly, because what would happen if it went poof is they would call a special election, and given the realities of what the Santos time in office have been, you got to imagine that folks on the ground there are not likely to elect another Republican. Every campaign arm in this building on the House and Democrat on the Republican and Democratic side are well aware of that, and that's why Democrats would be itching to get that special election going. Republicans would be quite nervous because it would shift more permanently one seat away from them in this very already slim majority state. But I also think that it's important to point out, too, that the people who are saying that he should be expelled are his own freshman Republican colleagues from New York. These are the very people who were elected in the same cycle as him, and now they're saying he doesn't deserve to serve. I do think we have to point out, though, Hallie, really fast, technically on the floor, Santos was expelled for 3 seconds until Congressman Desposito said, I want the yays and nays. That's usually something you do if something's close, but because there was basically no one in the chamber, if he didn't do that, there's an argument that could be made that said Santos was expelled.
Man, congressional procedure, Hallie. It is an art form all its own. Thank you. It is going to be fascinating to watch. Thanks for being there and for running after the congressman, too. Appreciate it. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the White House, we are just learning in the last couple of minutes, is announcing President Biden and the First Lady will visit Lewiston, Maine on Friday to honor and pay respects to the 18 people killed and the others hurt in the attack there last week, and to meet with victims' families and first responders after that mass shooting in Lewiston. Number 2, Tammy Murphy, the wife of the New Jersey governor, is reportedly getting ready to run for Senate. Democratic Senator Bob Menendez is up for re-election next year, but remember, he's been indicted here. He recently pleaded not guilty to acting as a foreign agent and corruption charges. It's not clear if he's going to run again. Number 3, the Pentagon is just launching a new tool to report UFOs. That's right. That's after they came out with a new UFO website a couple months ago. Right now, you can only fill out the form if you've spotted a UFO, if you are a former government employee, a current government employee. But officials say they're trying to look into ways at how the rest of us, the general public, can report sightings too. Number 4, Disney says it has agreed to buy Comcast's 1/3 stake in Hulu, so Disney will own all of Hulu. Disney's expecting to pay Comcast more than $8 billion for this. Comcast, of course, is the parent company of us here at NBC Universal. Number 5, Netflix says its cheaper ad-supported tier has now hit 15 million active users a month, triple the number of users it had back in May. Netflix rolled out this plan about a year ago to try to bring in more subscribers and more money, so there you go. When we come back, a race against time tonight in Kentucky. How rescuers are trying to find a man believed to be trapped under a collapsed 11-story coal plant. Plus, Eurasia's tallest active volcano is erupting. What officials are saying about the threat to people who live nearby in the global. The stock market's closing up today after the Fed decided to leave interest rates alone for the second straight time. And while the chair, Jay Powell, says he doesn't see any sign of a recession in the near future, that's good news. He does say that the Fed is committed to getting inflation down to 2%, suggesting another increase could still be on the table, maybe in December, maybe later. At the same time, it's a split screen here. You've got President Biden out in Minnesota today, also talking about the economy. He's trying to win over the rural vote in key states in America. We know that that is a sector of the country that's been hit hard by inflation the last couple of years. The president announcing more than $5 billion on things like adapting agriculture to climate change, putting in place more high-speed internet, improving infrastructure. Gabe Gutierrez is in Minnesota with more on that and the president in just a second. But I want to start with Brian Chung, who's covering all things Fed. It's so interesting to me every time we do this. Totally expected that he wasn't going to raise interest rates. Cool if you're trying to get a new mortgage, right? The interesting thing is the way that people parse his remarks around what's going to happen 2 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, right? What's the big takeaway tonight?
Yeah, it does feel like Groundhog Day sometimes because it's like, okay, well, they didn't do anything, and that's the news, that the Fed didn't do anything. They kept interest rates the same, which they had done in the previous meeting as well. But that says a lot because the Fed had been doing this aggressive interest rate hiking over the last year and a half. You recall in the this time last year, they were raising interest rates at 3/4 of a percentage point at a time. And the reason for why is inflation, inflation, inflation. That's what's hurting Americans at the store. And indeed, inflation has come down from the pace of 9% annually last year to 3.7% as of the last read. The Fed really wants to see that somewhere closer to 2%. But they say they don't have to continue to raise interest rates to get to that point. They can just keep them steady. But that still means high mortgage rates, 8% we're seeing in some cases. And because they're not cutting rates, there's no reason to think those will go down anytime soon, Hallie.
Well, that was my question, is what does it mean for, like, all of us regular folk out here, right? Like, is the mortgage piece is always a big part of this when it comes to the interest rates here? No expectation those are going to go down anytime soon, or do we just not know?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Federal Reserve Chairman was saying right now the decision is whether or not they want to raise interest rates again in December. They're not talking or thinking about cutting interest rates. And because credit card rates, which, by the way, are around 21, 22% right now, and mortgage rates somewhere between 7 and 8% right now, well, that means that those rates won't go down because the Fed's not talking about cutting interest rates. So it's still a pretty tough time to be missing any sort of payments right now.
Brian Chung, thank you so much. That tees us up nicely for Gabe Gutierrez, because, Gabe, what do we know that voters care about year after year consistently? It is the economy, right? That is so much. When I talk to folks around the White House and close to the president that they talk about when it comes to 2024, you are seeing that firsthand yourself on the ground there today, because we know that inflation has really hit some of these rural voters that the president is trying to appeal to hard.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hallie. We spoke with one farmer in Iowa today who was saying exactly that inflation has been up significantly in the last couple of years. And yes, it is on its way down, but it still has affected this farmer in Iowa in terms of costs for fuel, for food, and really affecting his business quite a bit. And with that in mind, President Biden came here to Minnesota to speak with rural voters here. And he's kicking off a 2-week blitz, not just him, but cabinet secretaries, senior administration officials, as they recognize that over the last couple of years, Hallie, Republicans have made a lot of gains when it comes to rural voters. Former President Trump over the last 2 presidential elections, and also Republicans in the 2022 midterms, now making up 69% of the rural vote. Today, as you said, the president touting an extra $5 billion in federal funding for rural communities. The administration says to help create jobs and expand access to broadband. Take a listen to part of the speech that President Biden gave, wrapped up just a short time ago here in this barn in Northfield. Take a listen.
When the middle class does well, the poor have a way up, and the wealthy still do very well. When rural America does well, when Indian country does well, we all do well.
Again, this is so high stakes, Hallie, because according to researchers at Cornell University, dating back to the year 2000, 94% of the job growth in this country has actually come from urban counties. So certainly this is something that the Biden administration, the Biden campaign, wants to pay a lot of attention to over the next year or so, Hallie.
When you talk about Minnesota, too, there is another element to what's happening globally that is significant here, and that is, of course, that Israel-Hamas war that we started the show talking about here. You saw Muslim and Arab community leaders holding a news conference, essentially. They are urging the United States to back more of a ceasefire right now, something that both U.S. officials and Israeli officials have said is simply not going to happen after that terror attack in early October. Talk us through some of that and the implications there.
Yeah, Hallie, this is something that could prove significant as we head into the 2024 presidential campaign ramping up. We have now heard it over the last several weeks in places like Michigan and actually here in Minnesota. I spent the day yesterday speaking with Jewish Americans, but also Palestinian Americans, and the Palestinian Americans especially. They were furious with the Biden administration for not supporting that ceasefire in Gaza at this point. So we were speaking with some of those voters. Leaders had set a deadline yesterday here in Minnesota for the Biden administration to change its course. Of course, that did not happen. There were some small demonstrations here during the president's visit as well. But I want to play for you some of that interview with a local Palestinian American leader about his response to how the Biden administration has handled this. Take a listen.
When we see the Democratic Party right now is dehumanizing the Palestinian, like Biden president the other day said, I don't trust the number of people dead that comes from Gaza. You don't have to have the exact number, Mr. President, but you have to have some empathy. And for him losing that empathy, I am done with Biden. I'm not voting Biden.
You know what was incredible, Hallie? You know, the thinking among some of these Muslim Americans that, yes, that perhaps they may stay home. Some of them, though, actually said that they would consider voting for former President Trump because, in their words, at least things were more peaceful under his administration. So think of that as just incredible when you think about it. A former president who supported the Muslim ban at this point, they are so furious with the Biden administration that they would even consider voting for former President Trump at this point. Hallie.
Gabe Gutierrez live for us there in Minnesota, traveling with President Biden. Gabe, thank you. NBC News covers hundreds of international stories every day, and because it can be tough to read or watch or listen to them all, our international teams have done it for you. Here are some of what they're watching in a segment we call The Global. Out of Peru, police are releasing kind of strange video of officers dressed up in Halloween costumes, yes, and arresting alleged drug dealers. Here they are. They're dressed as, you just saw them, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, the Bride of Chucky. They then go into a house. Apparently, they seized like 1,600 bags of cocaine in this Halloween operation in Russia. Check out this footage of a huge volcano that just erupted. Look at that. That's ash, something like 6 miles up into the sky. So far, no real impact on the area, like, you know, from a substantive way. Some schools have closed, so that's an impact. But scientists warn that smoke from the volcano that's floated some 230 miles could disrupt air traffic. And out of the UK, a London court says a huge $2 billion lawsuit against Apple can move forward. The company is accused of using defective batteries in some iPhones on purpose, basically to try to push people to get a replacement battery or a new phone more quickly. Apple calls the lawsuit baseless. Coming up here, more questions tonight about whether the eye drops you use are actually safe, what experts say you should know about the recent safety warnings, and why you shouldn't freak out just yet. That's coming up. For the first time in 20 years, the number of babies dying is going up to a shockingly high rate, according to the head of the American Academy of Pediatrics. On average, nationally, the infant mortality rate is up 3%. With 4 states, Georgia, Iowa, Missouri, and Texas, you see them here, reporting the highest rates for the death of babies in the country. The new CDC report shows that white and Native American babies, premature babies, and baby boys generally had higher death rates. Now, why is this happening? This spike, according to experts, seems to be driven by more complications for moms while pregnant and by more bacterial infection. Researchers say it could all be related to stress from the pandemic and inflation, from the opioid epidemic, and from the more limited access to abortion services after Roe versus Wade was overturned last year. I want to take you now down to Kentucky, where a huge rescue operation is happening as we speak, with the governor declaring a state of emergency. That's because officials say at least one person was killed. Another is still missing after a coal preparation plant, more than 100 feet tall, collapsed on top of them. You can see that footage right there. Our Noah Pransky has this race against time rescue.
Tonight, a race against time after tragedy in rural Kentucky.
A structural collapse has 2 individuals trapped in steel and concrete.
Workers pinned inside an 11-story coal preparation plant after the building collapsed.
As of right now, the situation doesn't look good.
One worker perished, county and state officials confirmed at a press conference today, and now a rescue mission underway to find the other. The collapse happened around 6:30 p.m. Tuesday, according to Kentucky Emergency Management, at the decommissioned Martin Mine Prep plant located near the border with West Virginia. The Martin County judge executive saying the men were at the bottom floor at the time working to prepare the building for demolition when it collapsed, pinning them under tons of concrete and steel. Rescuers got in contact with one of the workers following the collapse, but say he died during the attempt to save him. Now the search for the other continues.
We've talked with both of the families. It's never an easy thing. It's the toughest part of the job, but something that has to be done.
Kentucky's Governor Andy Beshear declaring a state of emergency in a tweet telling Kentuckians to brace for the worst, saying keep praying, but the scene is bad and we should be prepared for tough news out of Martin County.
It's horrific. I remember being in New York after 9/11, and those images that you see there, it's kind of what you see of the hollow here. Very large structure that has collapsed in on itself.
For now, a emergency responders still holding out hope they can rescue one survivor trapped under piles of twisted steel and rubble.
Noah is joining us now. Do we have any sense of why this plant collapsed in the first place?
No, not yet. The Kentucky State Police have launched an investigation, so they're looking into it, but they say it's too early to tell. As of this point, they're also now still considering this a rescue mission, not recovery. They're using cadaver dogs and heavy machinery, but no good news yet much of today, so hope a little bit diminishing in eastern Kentucky. Hallie?
Noah Pransky, thank you. Still to come here on the show, the New York Times digging into Ye, formerly Kanye West's almost decades-long partnership with Adidas, and found the company looked past misconduct for years before cutting ties with him. Our backstory tonight is with the reporter behind that scoop. Do not miss it. That's coming up. Time now to get the backstory. Our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. Tonight, what the New York Times is calling the fullest accounting of Adidas' relationship with Ye, the rapper who used to go by Kanye West, before the company dropped him last year over his anti-Semitic and offensive comments. But behind the scenes, the Times reports Adidas had been tolerating his misconduct for nearly a decade. It started in 2013 at the company's German headquarters when Adidas was pitching ideas to Ye for the first shoe they would make together. But two people in the meeting tell the paper Ye was not really into those ideas. And to show that, he reportedly grabbed a sketch of one shoe and drew a swastika on it. The Times also reporting that weeks before that, at a different meeting, Ye made Adidas executives watch porn to, quote, spark creativity. And that later he told a Jewish Adidas manager to kiss a picture of Hitler every day. While all of that was happening, there were conversations internally, according to this Times investigation, about how to make Ye happy, as the shoes were making the company millions of dollars every year, with internal company documents saying that the, quote, biggest issue is putting cash in Kanye's pocket to show how much it valued his impact on the brand, quote unquote. That was in March 2016. Eventually, things turned into what Adidas leadership called a code red, according to a group chat in October 19 of Adidas leadership, after West said in a text to executives that he wasn't going to ask for things that he says were owed to him, writing, and I'm quoting here, "This relationship dynamic changes now," per the Times. Now, Adidas still did not end things until late last year after, remember, the comments Ye made targeting Jewish people and the Black Lives Matter movement. We've reached out to Adidas. We haven't heard back yet. But in a statement to the Times, they say the company has no tolerance for hate speech and offensive behavior, which is why the company terminated the Adidas Yeezy partnership. Ye has not responded to requests for comments from NBC News or the Times. Megan Toohey, who reported the story out for the Times, is joining us now. Megan, extraordinary details in this story. You actually traveled to get this all nailed together to Portland, to L.A. You did interviews with Adidas, with current and former employees of Ye, hundreds of internal records you had to sift through here. The depth and the detail here just hasn't been reported before. Pull back the curtain for us here, because that's what this segment is all about. Talk about your process. Talk about what started you down this path in the first place.
Yeah, so, I mean, it was almost exactly 1 year ago that Adidas broke ties with Kanye West as he was making these anti-Semitic and other public inflammatory comments. And, you know, I realized that this was an extremely lucrative partnership, the Yeezy partnership that they were in for 10 years. They made billions of dollars. They put out more than 250 shoe styles of these Yeezys. I mean, it really pushed the boundaries of celebrity endorsement deals. And I wanted to know, I had some questions that went beyond the headlines last year. I wanted to know, was the behavior that we saw from Kanye West last fall indicative of a broader pattern of behavior or misbehavior? And if so, what did Adidas know? And when did they know it? And what did they do about it? So that's what set me off on this reporting track that involved traveling to Portland, traveling to LA, sort of slowly but surely getting people who had worked on this collaboration to talk to me, and then very significantly obtaining hundreds of internal, previously undisclosed records, text messages, contracts, internal company memos, and financial records that allowed me to slowly but surely to kind of piece together the behind-the-scenes story of this partnership and how this company tolerated misconduct for years in pursuit of celebrity and profit.
Given that Ye had already publicly made these just offensive anti-Semitic comments and that was known at the point that you started reporting this out, was it easier or harder than you expected to get some of these people in that orbit, in the Adidas orbit, to talk to you?
Yeah, it was really difficult. You know, they keep in mind that everybody who worked for Adidas and also for Mr. West on this collaboration had to sign multiple NDAs. And even though Kanye West had this public implosion of sorts last fall, he wasn't seen as being completely gone from the cultural world. I mean, I would say I'm not alone. I think a lot of people see him as being arguably one of the most powerful cultural figures in the world, somebody who has a tremendous track record of coming back from controversy. So there was a lot of fear among people about what it would mean to speak out. And that's why, you know, getting these internal company records was so significant, because I was actually able, through those records, to see what Adidas executives and employees were saying and doing behind the scenes as this relationship was unfolding in real time.
People may be, if you're not a sneakerhead, let me preface by saying you may be surprised, and you talked about this, at the many kinds of sneakers and partnerships here of Yeezy shoes that came out over the course of this relationship between Ye and Adidas here. I wonder, and by the way, apparently Ye is still making some money from this. Was there anything, Megan, that surprised you through the course of the reporting? Was there anything that you really stopped and went, wow, I did not expect that piece of it?
Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, I didn't have an appreciation for just how massively successful this partnership was. The fact that it had stretched for 10 years, the fact that they made billions of dollars together. Kanye West ended up making much more money from these Yeezy sneakers, from this collaboration, that he did from his music. And it was also a way by which, like, Adidas started to financially resurrect itself in this hyper-competitive sneaker industry. It had long been trailing behind Nike, which has this extremely successful Michael Jordan, you know, these Jordans that had really catapulted them to the top. And so I guess I was surprised to learn how significant and successful this partnership had been for both Adidas and Kanye, but then also how much conduct had happened behind the scenes and the lengths that Adidas went to basically accept and accommodate his behavior over the years as they became more and more dependent on profits. And you're right, it stretched right back to that one of the very first meetings at Adidas headquarters in Germany when he drew that swastika, and it unfolded from there.
Megan, I know we're running out of time here, but just in case people are going, wait a second, Megan Twohey, why do I know that name? It's because you worked on so many just incredible pieces of investigative journalism. People know, I think, the Harvey Weinstein story that you were part of breaking. You were one of the first journalists to get on the story of untested rape kits, for example. When you're taking these hugely important and sprawling stories, Megan, can you give us some insight into your process of how you begin to go about that? Not just for this one, but pulling back more broadly over the course of the last many years for you here.
Yeah, well, listen, I think that and when we were reporting the Harvey Weinstein story in 2017, ultimately we realized that we weren't just kind of tracking and documenting the behavior of one bad man, that there were a lot of individuals and institutions that glimpsed this misbehavior and tolerated it and were complicit. And I think that that's always like a driving question that fuels my work, is not just the sort of individual bad actors, but how entire companies can come to tolerate misconduct and even become complicit in it.
Megan Twohey, we're so glad to have you on. Thank you very much for giving us a glimpse into the behind-the-scenes process for you. Appreciate it. That does it for us for this hour. We've got a lot more coverage picking up right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.